So as of right now, all of the EX cards have been released for Pokemon TCG Pocket. There are events down the road releasing more cards, but none of these are going to be new EX variants like we have just seen with Lapras EX. So I am going to make a tier list of all the current EX cards from Pokemon TCG Pocket. Getting things started with Venusaur EX. Now I might have some bias here, but I am currently running a Venusaur EX deck, and ever since I started running Venusaur EX, I haven't gone back. Now there's multiple ways to play this card, but the fact of the matter is, if you get a Venusaur EX set up and it has at least 3 energy on it by your turn that you get it set up, it's very hard to lose at that point. That being said, it does take a while to get set up because it is a 3-stage Pokemon. So there are some things that can go wrong when playing this card. You might not be able to pull an Ivysaur or even the Venusaur EX in time to get it set up. But once you have it set up, the energy factor isn't that big of a deal. It takes 4 energy for its main attack. But there's so many supporting cards that will just keep your Venusaur EX alive, even if you don't have the amount of energy on it that you need to get the most out of this card. So with that being said, I will be putting Venusaur in S-. I'm giving it a ton of points for essentially being unbeatable once fully set up. But I'm taking away some points just because setting it up does take some time and things can go wrong. Next up is Exeggutor EX. Now this card is pretty interesting. It only takes 1 energy for its attack. So I do see a lot of people running this card alongside Venusaur EX. But on its own, it can't really be the main card of a deck, in my opinion. RNG is something that I really do consider when making a deck, and I don't really like cards that have RNG. So I'm going to give it a lot of points deducted off for that. And because it really can't be the main superstar of your deck, I am going to put it in B-. It isn't a bad card. It can be a good supporting card. It can be a really quick card, and if you are lucky, it does pay off. But you know, we've all been there. We do get unlucky, and 40 damage isn't that crazy for an EX card. Now we're on a Charizard EX. This is one of the more popular cards out there being used, and I do see why. It does 200 damage, and if you get it set up right, it's unstoppable. It's unstoppable if you can evolve it all the way up until Charizard EX, and if your Moltres is getting the energy that you need to put onto this Charizard EX, you're going to win the game. But that's a lot of what ifs. There is a lot of RNG that comes into it, and standalone, this card will not survive without a Moltres EX. So it does get some points off for that. I will not deny that this is a very dominant card, and if the stars do align, it's pretty much unstoppable at 200 damage. So I will put it in the A tier. I will put it in neutral A. And now we have Arcanine EX. A very, very disappointing card. You have to set it up. It has an evolution line, only 1 evolution, which is not bad, but only does 140 damage for 3 energy, and you still damage yourself, and by no means is this a tanky Pokemon. So I'm gonna put it in F tier. I'm gonna put it in F+. I do see a little, you know, positivity from it. But it's really difficult to actually see some competitive play and consistent play out of this card. And now we have Moltres EX, one of the most useful cards to have in your deck, especially if you're running fire. Now I see this card being paired up with Charizard or Centiskorch, and its main attack that only costs 1 energy can really set up your bench for success if you hit those heads. But more often than not, you're at least going to roll 1 heads out of 3, which will grant you 1 energy for your bench Pokemon. And that's a pretty good engine to have. Its other attack only does 70 damage for 3 energy, and that's not really the best. So I'm gonna give it an A+ ranking. Again, it's weird, this card is fantastic, but it can't be your main damager, which does deduct some points from it. Now moving on to Lapras EX, the newest EX introduced to Pokemon TCG Pocket. I don't see a lot of significance coming out of this card. 80 damage for 3 energy isn't that crazy. It has an added effect of healing 20 damage to Lapras EX, which, you know, it does help, it is beneficial, but with 140 HP, it really isn't that big of a tank. kind of like how Venusaur is with 190 HP, and it also heals with its attack. It just doesn't feel as substantial. It kind of feels like a throwaway. I feel like this card would be better to play off of the ice type of Lapras and giving you the option to flip a coin, and if heads, you can paralyze your opponent's active Pokemon. That would have been way more useful. That would have bumped this up to A, maybe even S tier. But right now, I'm going to put it right in the middle at B neutral. Now we have Blastoise EX, and I feel like Blastoise EX is underrated. Obviously, it is a difficult card to set up. You have to have a lot of energy on it, as well as it being a 3-stage Pokemon. If your Misties are hitting, this card could be super dangerous though. I think it's pretty solid. I just don't see a lot of people playing this card. Which I do understand. It is a hard card to set up properly, and for that I'm gonna put it in the C tier, but I'm gonna give it C+. I think it's pretty decent. I think it's above average for sure. Now we have Starmie EX. It's a 2-stage EX Pokemon, and it takes 2 energy to do 90 damage, not to mention it has 0 retreat cost. That is insane. This card could be your main damager. It could be a good supporting card. It's just fantastic. I think it's the most versatile card currently in the meta, and for that reason, I'm gonna give it S+. I wholeheartedly think this is one of the best cards in Pokemon TCG Pocket. Speaking of relevant cards, we have Articuno EX. Now this paired with Misty could be a nightmare. But doing 80 damage as well as 10 damage to each of your opponent's bench Pokemon, this is a menace of a card. Those 10 damage ticks could really put your opponent's cards in one-shot territory by the time they swap them out. It's so relevant, it's so useful, it's very easy to use, and most importantly, you don't really need to rely on flipping coins. Sure, Misty does help, but 3 energy isn't a whole lot. I think Misty's just an added benefit to this card. I think it's very solid. I'm gonna put it in S tier, but I'm gonna put it alongside Venusaur in S-. The next card we have to talk about is Pikachu EX, and this is a fantastic card again. It's a 1-stage EX, so there isn't really any setup, and it only takes 2 energy. The only catch is you have to have Pokemon on the bench. And that, in theory, could be pretty easy, but of course there are always times where you don't get a lot of luck. The most damage this card can do on its own is 90 damage. This doesn't take into account weaknesses or Giovanni. And in a world where a lot of the meta-relevant cards are weak to electric type, this card matches up pretty well. I'm gonna give Pikachu a neutral S ranking. It's a fantastic card. I just don't think it is as versatile as Starmie EX. Next up, we have Zapdos EX, which is Pikachu EX's best friend apparently. This card has a low retreat cost as well as a low entry point, which is 1 energy for Peck. Now it does take 3 energy for its main move, and I have mixed feelings about it just because it is all RNG. You have to flip a coin 4 times, and how many times you roll heads, you get to multiply it by 50. So the reality of it, you are rarely ever going to get 4 heads for this, giving you 200 damage. Most of the time, I've seen people get 2 heads, which is 100 damage, which is still nothing to blink at, but there is still that possibility you could get 1 heads or even none. So I'm not a huge fan of RNG. There's too much that can go wrong with this card. It's a good support card, but again, you're not going to have a Zapdos EX deck centered around this card. I'm gonna give it A, but I'm gonna give it A-. Gengar EX is up next, and I do see it pretty often, and I don't really understand why. It's a 3-stage EX Pokemon. Its attack does 100 damage for 3 energy, and it has an added ability that prevents your opponent from using support cards, which is great, but by the time you have Gengar set up, there just really isn't a lot of need to use supporter cards. Sure, Sabrina, Giovanni, maybe even Erica, but I'm sure all of the professor's researches, all of the Misties have been used up by then. And those are the main support cards that you really need to play, and they're basically out of the picture. So I see its ability kind of useless. Maybe if you can set it up quickly enough, it will work and it will, you know, do its job and win you the game solely because of its ability. But it really isn't that impactful. I'm gonna say it's below average. It does have its moments, and if the stars truly do align, it can work, but I'm gonna give it C-. And here we go, we have Mewtwo EX, one of the most popular decks in the meta today. For 2 energy, it does 50 damage, and for 4 energy, it does 150 damage, but you also have to discard 2 energy from that card. However, this card is always paired with Gardevoir, who can set it right back up by giving it an energy, and then you just place an energy on it, and it's just infinite 150 damage hits. Another thing going for Mewtwo EX is there aren't any big hitter dark type Pokemon, so its weakness is pretty much non-existent. So this card has a lot of good moments. However, it entirely relies on the success of Gardevoir. You are going to have a Gardevoir fully set up, which is a 3-stage Pokemon on your bench, which isn't an easy thing to do. You have to get your Gardevoir set up as well as your Mewtwo set up. And with a simple Sabrina, your Gardevoir dream could be ruined. I feel like this deck is getting exposed as the days go by. Whenever I run into a Mewtwo EX deck running Venusaur, I don't really blink an eye because I know I'm going to win that matchup. So I'm going to put Mewtwo in A tier. I think it does have a lot of good moments. It is very popular, but there are a lot of holes in its play style. Moving on to our first fighting type EX, we have Machamp, who does 130 damage for 3 energy. It's also a 3-stage Pokemon, so it does take a while to set up. With Mewtwo in the meta, it's really not looking good for this card. I rarely run into a Machamp user, and it's pretty basic. 130 damage for 3 energy. That's all it does, which isn't bad. It isn't bad, but it's pretty basic. And the fact that it's 3-stage really does deduct a lot of points from it. So I'm gonna put it in the D tier. I'm gonna say D plus because, like, you know, if you have it fully set up, it could work, but like, it's not looking good. And next up we have Marowak, and Marowak has recently seen a lot of play in the meta. It's a 2-stage EX Pokemon, and for 2 energy it can do upwards 160 damage. Again, it's all up to RNG. You flip 2 coins, and if you get heads, you multiply that number by 80. So there is a reality where you're only doing 80 damage, which actually really isn't bad. But you could do 0, and that does happen a lot. With Pikachu being so relevant, this card does see a lot of play, and it does see a lot of upside as well. And since it's only 1 stage and takes 2 energy, it gets set up very quickly. So with all that being said, I'm gonna give it a B spot. I really don't like the RNG plays. I kind of like guarantees and how much damage you're going to do, so that's why all the S tiers don't really rely on coin flips aside from Articuno, but it doesn't really rely on it. It's just like an added benefit. But last but not least, we have Wigglytuff EX. Now this card is interesting. I have been seeing a lot of more play through this card. It's a 1-stage EX, and for 3 energy, it does 80 damage, but you can put your opponent to sleep. And that could be very annoying for your opponent, especially if they're unlucky. And again, this is an RNG card, but it isn't like fully RNG. It's kind of like RNG as an added benefit, similar to Articuno. It isn't as practical as Articuno, so I'm going to give it some points deducted, but I'm going to give this card a B plus as well. So this is the tier list as it stands in today's meta. This is just all my opinion. I've been playing Pokemon TCG Pocket since it came out every day, multiple times a day. I'm having a blast with this game. I can't wait for the next set to come out so we get more EX cards or even more supporting cards to make the current meta more interesting. I would really like to see a dark type EX. Controversial, if Gengar EX was dark type, I would probably put it in the B tier, maybe even low A, but that's just me. Let me know in the comments if you agree with this tier list or what you would do differently. Any opinion is welcome. So if you enjoyed this content, make sure you like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.